Just off out for a quick 15 miler if you boys fancy joining me.
No, you're all right, mate.
Are you sure?
Greg, do you ever ask yourself, why am I putting myself through this again?
Do you know what? I can't help myself. I'm a glutton for punishment. My name is Professor Greg Whyte. I'm an Olympian, a sports scientist and an endurance specialist. And I'm often asked, what's the secret of success in endurance competition? Well, getting yourself in the right physical shape is one thing. But for me, endurance is a battle that's fought and won in the mind. This is a film that gives you an insight into the mental strategies I've used for years through the story of an extraordinary year in my life, and demonstrates to any budding athlete watching that with the right endurance mindset, you too can overcome adversity and become unstoppable. Endurance events have been a part of my life for almost 50 years. As an Olympian, I competed in modern pentathlon, a multidisciplinary sport. I went to 2 Olympic Games, the 1992 Olympics in Barcelona and the 1996 Olympics in Atlanta, and won a silver medal at the World Championships in 1994. For many years, I've been the endurance specialist for Sport Relief, a worldwide aid organisation. I've trained dozens of celebrities to successfully complete some enormous endurance challenges, including swimming the English Channel, cycling the length of Britain, and summiting Kilimanjaro, the tallest freestanding mountain in the world, twice, in order to help raise millions of pounds for people less fortunate than ourselves. I've competed in some of the toughest endurance races on the planet, including the Marathon des Sables, the Race Across America, and a host of Ironman triathlon competitions. But nothing could have prepared me for the Norseman. This extreme triathlon pushed me harder than anything before it. It was always going to be incredibly tough, but the race was made even more so by the unseasonably hot weather, which peaked at a blistering 34 degrees C. The Norseman was an incredible event that captured the essence of endurance sport and triathlon and capped off an incredible 2019 for me. But just around the corner was a major challenge that was going to affect all of us. COVID-19 has been a global health catastrophe, not only affecting our physical health, but also our mental health. It was an unprecedented time in world history, and each country had their own response. In the UK, we locked down on and off for 2 years, which basically meant that we were isolated from each other. We lost our freedom, we lost our confidence, and the structure of life as we all knew it unravelled. I don't think that there was anyone whose mental health wasn't affected by the dreadful situation. I know mine was. Which brings me around to what this film is all about. For me, I found the isolation particularly difficult. Endurance competition is all about freedom. You're outside amongst nature. To be suddenly trapped inside, locked down at home was difficult, and I'm sure my wife and kids will agree. My years of experience from endurance competition has taught me that structure was the key to success, both physically and mentally. And I knew that by employing the same techniques and strategies that I've used all my life, that I could get back to feeling like myself again. And so, with the rollout of vaccinations and the gradual lifting of COVID restrictions, I set myself a challenge. Not just any challenge, the most extreme challenge I could think of, which I knew would probably be made even more difficult by the restrictions we were still faced with, and then turn that journey into a film. My hope is that not only does this provide an insight into an extraordinary year in my life, but it also provides an endurance mindset toolkit for anyone aiming to tackle an endurance challenge. And as I always say, nothing good comes easy. But honestly, this one nearly broke me.
Patagon Man is an extreme triathlon that takes place in the pristine beauty of Chile's Patagonia region. Like its equally tough sibling, Norseman, the race begins with a leap from a passenger ferry. An icy 3.8-kilometre swim is followed by a 180-kilometre bike race up through some of the steepest terrain that Chile has to offer. Finally, competitors run 42.2 kilometres along mountainous gravel trails to cross the finish line and ring the bell in Puerto Ingenio, Ibanez.
Amongst the chaos of the COVID-19 pandemic, competing in an extreme triathlon on the other side of the planet seemed like the perfect solution to me. And so that brings me to the endurance mindset number 1. So goal setting is absolutely crucial to success. And in my opinion, without setting goals, you are destined to failure. Now, of course, it's not just about setting goals, it's making sure those goals are the right goals. And there are a host of different models that you can use. My personal favorite is the SMART approach. And with SMART, that means that they are specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and timely. By ensuring that each of those goals hits those different criteria, you can ensure that you've got the right goals at the right time to deliver success. Patagon Man was not only going to be tough physically and mentally, I'm 54 now, and believe you me, it doesn't get any easier. It was also going to be tough practically. With travel restrictions in place around the world based on a red to green traffic light system dependent on the levels of COVID-19 infection, there were lots of logistical problems to deal with. The first, of course, was getting there, and also, arguably more importantly, being able to get back. But for me, in the short term, there was a much bigger problem, and that was that swimming pools and gyms were closed, and they are a fundamental part to triathlon training. Add on top of that, the restrictions and the lockdown meant that we could only leave our houses by a certain distance. Now that led to an awful lot of running around in circles. But the most difficult thing for me was the absence of movement, the absence of people. No cars on the road, no people on the streets. It was like a ghost town. Without options, I decided to strip back my training to the absolute basics and move to what I like to call the green gym. There's lots of science about the benefits of working out in the great outdoors. For example, there are enhanced happy hormones released, things like dopamine when we take it outdoors. There's improved physical benefits. We actually work harder for longer when we go outside. And after what we'd all been through, connecting with nature felt like absolutely the right thing to do. I always say nothing great is ever achieved alone, and luckily I managed to pull together the same team that I'd had success with at the Norseman. Incredibly important for mindset, and let's face it, I needed everything I could get at this stage. Central to the team is Richard Ball, aka Bally. He is my oldest pal and a formidable athlete. He would be accompanying me on the run leg of the Patagon Man as he did on the Norseman. Bally lives in France, where they had a whole different set of COVID restrictions. I only hoped that he would be ready in time. So listen, how's training going?
Oh mate, it's difficult. I mean, we've got the restrictions quite similar to you. We're allowed to go out for an hour, but within 1 kilometre of the house. So, I'm getting out and doing stuff, but I mean, it's well, as you can appreciate, it's really difficult. And also for us, we need to have an authorization piece of paper, so we need to put our details down. And if you get stopped without that, you get fined, quite big fine. So, it's a real challenge. I managed to get stuff done, obviously, for the challenge, but it's not going as great. I mean, it's not what ideal, is it? Going into this kind of challenge, trying to support you. I'd like to have done a lot more, I must admit, but we do what we can.
Success is not a chance event. So for me, planning and preparation is absolutely key to delivering that success. And in that, I've got this little motto. It's not about hoping for the best and hoping things will go well. It's actually about preparing for the worst and then hoping for the best. So that what you know is that if something goes wrong, you've got a solution to that problem, which will enable you to keep going and bring you to that success you're looking for. It was important for me to learn the lessons of the Norseman. And what's crucial about that is actually it's all a learning. Is that every time I race, I'm learning something new and I'm adapting the way in which I approach the next race. And when it comes to the Norseman, the one thing that I learned was that I am a swimmer on a bike and it is incredibly hilly. So in preparation for the Patagon Man, what I'm doing is looking at very much the lower body, enhancing strength, developing power, making sure that bike leg, the very, very tough bike leg, becomes more manageable so that when I'm off the bike, I can then hit the run and hit the run hard to run as fast as possible. I mean, the human brain has developed over millennia, and fundamentally it is a protection system. It's a gateway which is controlling your actions to keep you safe. So the bottom line is, running up a mountain is always a very bad idea. And so what we have to do is we have to create solutions for that. We call that the central governor, where the brain is governing what the body is doing. And so what we're doing is we're effectively teaching the brain about what our new limits are. How far can we push it? And that's where training becomes absolutely crucial, because in training, what we are doing is progressively teaching the brain that we can push further, we can go harder, and we can do it for longer. Despite what they say, size is not everything. And in fact, quality counts. And I think the tendency for some people is to hit every training session as hard as possible, when actually what you should do is step back, take a look at the plan, and look at the short-term goals, which are created to improve those weaknesses and maintain those strengths. And in doing that, what we get is we get these short-term gains, these short-term wins, which feed the brain. And what they do is that they feed a positive mental mindset, which allow us to develop progressively to the point where we're going to push ourselves longer, harder, and more intensely towards our racing goal. At the end of the day, all of those feed into what I like to think of as the happy bank. The happy bank is a reservoir of happiness that you have actually created during training. And the great thing is that you can dip into that happiness when times get tough during racing. Effectively, the short-term goals that you have set create success. That success creates happiness, which you then embed into your brain. And so when it comes to racing, those periods when it's very, very difficult, what you can do is you can draw on the experience of training, you can draw on that happiness, and that will enable you to keep going and keep driving to the finish. There are a host of psychological tools that you can use during those dark periods, but for me, one of the most important is positive self-talk, is essentially telling yourself you can do it. So at those moments in any race, in any training session where I think I can't go on, what I do is I actually just quiet the brain. I quiet that side of my brain which is telling me how tough it is and can I make it, am I going to make it? And what I do is I replace those thoughts with positive thoughts about, yes, you can make it, you've done it before, think about the training you've done, all of those things. And that positive self-talk effectively becomes louder than the negative thoughts and enables you to keep going. Having the right kit for an event is absolutely essential, but it's not just about the physiology, it's also about the psychology. And just because you've spent a huge amount of money on a piece of kit doesn't mean to say that it's right for you. And in fact, the more you spend, if it doesn't work, that actually is a negative feedback for the brain. Is the brain is now thinking, why am I not going faster despite having spent all of this money? So the key is to make sure that you get the right kit that works for you, that has a positive impact on your performance. It's not always about spending more, it's about spending more time to make sure the kit is right for you. Now for the Norseman, the team at iRide had sorted me out with an outstanding Oro bike, and my attitude is always, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. I knew it worked for me. All I needed to do now was adapt it for the Patagon man. And that to me was incredibly important, not just physically, but psychologically. I had confidence in my equipment. All I needed to do was make some small adaptations. And those adaptations were changing the TT bars. And interestingly, we changed the wheels and increased the width of the wheel. Now that doesn't add significantly to the rolling resistance of the bike, but what it does do is it improves comfort. And what that comfort does, not only does it give me positive feedback physically, but mentally, if it feels more comfortable, I can drive harder for longer and be more successful on that bike stage. Knowing your enemy is absolutely essential for the endurance mindset. Every endurance event has a unique set of environmental challenges. So doing your research and understanding what those challenges are is absolutely crucial. For example, if the race is in sea for swimming, then what you need to do is train in the sea. Very different to freshwater swimming. If you are going up in altitude on the bike or the run, then you need to train at altitude in order to optimize that adaptation. As former Director of Research for the British Olympic Medical Centre, I had access to an altitude chamber. There are quite a few chambers up and down the UK, and I thoroughly recommend seeking them out if altitude could be a factor in your challenge. In addition to your body adapting, your mind also adapts. For example, understanding pacing and understanding tactical changes that need to take place at altitude. But be warned, it is tough. My oxygen saturation would have had me admitted to hospital in this session. As we entered October, the world started opening up, albeit with a host of restrictions. And training was going really well, so physiologically I was in great shape. But I hadn't competed for over 2 years, and psychologically I just needed to know that I could cope with the environmental differences between Chile and the UK, which are miles apart. And so, fully vaccinated up, fully masked, we headed out to Croatia for an intensive training camp. Croatia was the closest I could find in terrain to Chile, and as a green country on the traffic light list, one that I was able to get to easily. Incredible opportunities to swim, loads of rugged gravel trails, biking up extreme hills, and importantly, all this in the heat. We were entering winter in the UK, and in December, when the Patagon Man was taking place, it was going to be summer in Chile, with expected temperatures at around 32 degrees C. I'm sometimes asked about the validity of a training camp. For me, I think they are fantastic environments to really focus your mind on the job in hand. You've got no other distractions, no commitments, and importantly, no excuses. You surrender to the training. Any anxieties you have are quietened by the assurances of your preparation. It's a really important moment to know when you are ready, when the training is done. At this point, there is always a danger of pushing a little bit more, pushing a little bit harder, and then coming to the start line injured or exhausted. You have to believe that you have delivered to your plan, that you have filled your happy bank, that you have prepared as well as you possibly can. It is at that moment you become unstoppable. And whatever happens in the race, what you know is that you have won the race to be prepared. With 1 month to go until Patagon Man, I began the important process of tapering. After 7 long months of brutal training, of preparing my mind and body in the shadow of COVID, of pushing myself harder than I'd ever done before, what could possibly go wrong? Dear athlete, as you may know, ASEN is still in phase 2 of the national COVID plan. However, we are working directly with the Ministry of Sport to get an exceptional permit to execute the race, even in this phase. We have heard you, and we know that most of you at this point just want to race. That's why we are doing everything imaginable to make this happen. The final decision should be made by Thursday, November the 25th. If we have no positive confirmation by the Ministry of Sport by then, the race will be postponed to 2022. So basically, we've got a number of days again to wait. I mean, it's I mean, you know, it's incredible. Obviously, that is how it's been for months now, and there are much worse things going on with COVID, without any shadow of a doubt. But it is incredibly difficult to prepare when we don't know if it's on or if it's off. And in fact, we are due to fly out on the 30th of November. And we won't know until the 25th whether we're actually going or not. So it's going to be a few more days of waiting, and let's hope we get a positive result. Vaccinations done, forms completed, logistics in place, 7 months of arduous training done. And with just 10 days to go before we fly out to the race, despite the best efforts of the race organisers, it's cancelled. And it's not just me, it's 300 other athletes, all of their support staff, the local hotels, the local population who rely upon this event are all going to be affected by this decision. What can you say? For me, this was the endurance experience in a nutshell. I mean, let's face it, no race ever goes entirely to plan. But the key here is actually to be able to improvise, to be able to adapt, to believe that you are physically prepared, to believe that you are mentally prepared, and look to where you can have success going forward. And as I always say, nothing good comes easy. And by that, I mean that what we have to do is push ourselves to the absolute limit. We have to think of ourselves as a different individual, as a different animal. We have to expand our horizons of what is possible if we are truly to achieve what we are able to achieve. Which frankly is a good thing, because I'd just come up with the most ludicrous idea.
Keltman is an extreme triathlon that takes place in the rugged beauty of the Highlands of Scotland. The race begins with a 3.8 kilometre swim across the freezing depths of Loch Shieldag. The bike takes you 180 kilometres up through some of the most spectacular scenery in the British Isles, before you begin a 42.2 kilometre run in which you climb 2 Monroes. Keltman is known as one of the toughest races out there, and alongside Norseman and Patagon Man, takes its rightful place as one of the world's big 3 extreme triathlons.
I can't get to Chile, but I can get to Scotland. The only problem is, Keltman's not on. It's a summer event. And let's face it, what sort of nutter goes up to the northwest of Scotland to complete an extreme triathlon in December?
Well, what's it going to be like? I mean, what kind of temperatures are we looking at?
I mean, yeah, it's the Highlands of Scotland in December, so they've already got snowfall there. There's snow on the ground already. I mean, the temperatures will be in the low single figures centigrade, but then of course it's the water temperature is probably the real thing. And we're swimming in a place called Loch Shieldag, which is actually it opens to the Atlantic, so it's brackish, so it's a mixture of salt and fresh water, and the water temperature there is definitely going to be in the low single figures centigrade. So it's going to be it'll be chilly.
Because you've got the added danger as well of, ice on the roads and stuff. I mean, as a mate, and as your co-pilot, as it were, I mean, this is dangerous. This has got the potential to be very dangerous. Yeah, I mean, we've got hypothermia, onset of frostbite. I mean, all those things we need to take into consideration. This is a tough one. It's one thing doing these challenges in the summer, whether it be Patagonia or Scotland, but doing it in the winter, I think we've got, I've got real concerns about this one.
I had to do it. I had to race. You've got to remember that while some of the world was trying to open up, other parts were locking down again. Infection rates were going through the roof, with new variants of COVID being discovered. Who knew what was around the corner for any of us? And like so many people, I found lockdown tough. Doing this race was an essential part of my return to normal life, part of my return to a way of life I recognised. I simply couldn't just walk away. But there were new risks. Chile and Scotland were obviously very different places with different potential dangers. But going through my mental toolkit, I had a goal, my body and mind was prepared. I'd hit all of my short-term and long-term goals in training, and my happy bank was full. Thanks to a lifetime of racing in different climates, I felt sure that I knew my enemy and could adapt my plan to fit this new challenge. The most important thing was, I was ready. I was unstoppable. As long as there weren't too many surprises along the way, it would all be fine.
Storm Bara arrives in the UK on Tuesday, likely to bring disruptive wind and hill snow to northern England and Scotland in particular.
The approaching storm was exactly what we didn't need. The weather was going to force the temperature to plummet even lower than we feared, with the hill snow, torrential rain and gale force winds making the swim, bike and run leg all potentially very dangerous. So we met with a team and the local guides to discuss the plan for the course itself. And what we realised was that the full Keltman, the Ironman distance, simply wasn't going to be possible, fundamentally on safety grounds. Starting in the pitch black, ending in the pitch black, meaning that we'd be running high into the mountains in the black. And then of course, add on top of that was this potential level 4 storm coming in. So we took the decision early to target a half Ironman. And that would be our focus, to try and complete a half Ironman across all the disciplines. And where possible, we would go beyond that, but only when it was safe. Our half Ironman route would follow that of the full Kelpman as best it could. On safety grounds, we decided to enter the swim from the jetty at Shieldag and make our way 1.9 kilometres along Shieldag Island before returning to shore and transition 1. The 90-kilometre bike route would take us from Shieldag to Gairloch via Kinloch U. We would be travelling through some incredible countryside, beside Loch Torridon, through the valley in the spectacular Ben Ear Range, then along the length of Loch Marie, before turning back and returning the way we travelled to transition 2. Finally, the 21-kilometre run would begin from Kinloch U. However, if our calculations were correct, by this point, not only would we be losing light, the predicted storm would be in full force too. So we made a plan to follow the first half of the Kelpman run route towards Torrin Coolin before heading towards the finish line at the entrance to the town of Torridon.
Tomorrow's a big day. Greg's ready for this, physiologically and psychologically. He's prepared fantastically for this. He is ready for it. The problem that we've got is that the conditions are absolutely brutal. So the water is going to be extremely cold, and we've got to monitor him very, very carefully. We might need to pull him out if it gets too cold in there. On the bike, you've got the chance of snow and ice on the road, and again, that's going to be treacherous for Greg. And again, the run, some of it's going to be off-road, so the conditions are going to be absolutely brutal for him. Every confidence he's going to do it, but fingers crossed for that weather.
With everything in place physically, now it was a challenge of the mind. I think the key moment of any challenge is just prior to the start, because there is a mixture of excitement, of anticipation of the challenge ahead, but also of fear. And that fear can become pervasive if you're not very, very careful. It can overwhelm everything. You know, I've spent months thinking about the challenge. And of course, for this challenge, it changed dramatically from the Patagon man in Chile. Now we're in Torridon in northwest Scotland in the middle of winter. And the challenges that lay ahead are incredibly different. Of course, it is absolutely pitch black, and what I'm wearing, which we don't usually wear, are glow sticks, and those glow sticks really are for the crew, the team, to be able to see me, because in this darkness you can see absolutely nothing. And so it's really about bringing all of those things together and just reiterating in your mind how prepared you are, what you are ready to do, the fact that you've got the right team around you, that you've planned everything to make sure that you can get from point A to point B, that you can actually complete this challenge. But the most important thing is that you can do that safely. And the interesting thing is that when you enter water, when it's completely dark, is that the first thing that hits you obviously is the cold. I mean, incredibly cold. And almost instantly, everything goes numb. But then at that point, you look up and you realize that when you're down that low at water level, you literally can see absolutely nothing. I mean, I've swum in every ocean on the planet. I've swum all around the world. I've swum thousands of hours in open water. And this experience was utterly unique. It was one of the most frightening experiences I've ever had in the water. The weirdest thing about swimming in the dark generally, but particularly when it's cold, is knowing the difference between the water and the sky. Because the face is completely numb, you can't really tell when you turn to breathe whether your face is out of the water or in the water, because there's no contrast, there's no light and dark, it's dark and dark, and you've lost feeling in your face. And that's a really interesting place to be. And in fact, if you look at swimming style in that environment, is that you end up swimming really quite upright. What you're doing is using kinesthetic awareness, that body position, so that you can know confidently that your mouth is out of the water before you take a big deep breath in, because you don't want to do that when your face is in the water. I mean, the interesting thing for the team, it's incredibly difficult for the team on the boat because they're in the pitch black as well. Add on top of that, because they're on the surface, the wind was howling up the loch that day, and so it's moving the boat around me. And then they're, whilst filming, shining lights on me. So I'm moving from a position where it's pitch black into absolute bright light. And what that does, it just disorientates you. So on a number of occasions, what I found myself doing is either the boat was coming into me or I was simply swimming into the boat and hitting the boat. And that's quite a disconcerting situation to be in as well, because you just don't expect to touch anything. One of the key things to think about is actually the wildlife that's out there. And it's always interesting because normally you can see what's in front of you and what's beneath you. In this darkness, you can't see anything. So when you hit something, and you pull through it, it's like, is that seaweed? Is it a jellyfish? You're never quite sure what it is. Of course, the one positive is that I'm so numb that if it is a jellyfish and it stings me, I won't feel it for a few hours anyway. But it's quite an unusual scenario where normally what you can do is you can confirm what it is. So if you hit something, you take a look, you realise it's seaweed, no problem, and carry on. In that sort of darkness, you hit something, it could be anything. And perhaps the worst thing is actually when you hit the boat, because when you hit something solid, you shouldn't hit anything solid. Instantly, you have a reaction to that. And then it's making sure that you understand what it is. And obviously the boat you can see, so you can tell yourself that straight away. But then immediately following that, it's a big sympathetic drive. You know, the adrenaline starts to buzz. You've got to bring it back down again, relax, take control, and continue on at that same pace, making sure you keep it level on a continual basis, because the swim is just the first of 3 disciplines for today. There's a lot of brutality that lies ahead. But getting out of the water is probably the real danger point. I've been supine for quite a long period of time in very cold water, and you stand up instantly, straight away that disorientates you. Luckily at that point, Bally comes in and just grabs me by the arm, and at that point I know I'm safe. And I know it's the end of the swim. And as he grabs me, I can use him to guide me into the back. But actually it's that point, that's the point that the real danger starts. When we're in water, when we're actually in cold water and we're swimming, what we're doing is we're generating a huge amount of energy in order to swim. And much of that energy, in fact about 3/4 of that energy, is dissipated as heat. As soon as we get out of the water, a couple of things happen. We stop swimming, so we stop generating heat. Number one. And number two is that the periphery is really cold, so the arms and legs and the head are really cold. And what we start to do is we start to move blood to those areas, and so therefore the blood is cooled at that point. And so what can happen when we get out of the water is this thing called the after drop, is we see a very, very rapid drop in core body temperature, which can be incredibly dangerous. It can lead to things like hypothermia, but equally the end of that spectrum is it can lead to arrhythmias and it can lead to death. The key thing is to rewarm, but not, again, you can't rewarm too quickly. If you rewarm too quickly, that can lead to all sorts of problems as well. Wet clothing is going to keep us cool, so we try and get that off as quickly as possible, dry as quickly as possible, and then re-wrap.
I'll tell you something.
Yeah. Cool.
If you've never been scared, do that.
And then add on top of that, warm fluids can be really helpful. Being very, very careful, because remembering the face is completely numb. So if that warm fluid is too hot, it is very easy to burn yourself on that fluid. And just when you think, right, this is as bad as it gets, Andy Digweed has made the coffee that day, and I cannot tell you how bad it tasted.
Who made this bloody coffee?
I called it Bisto on the day. I was being kind, to be honest with you. I have never tasted coffee so bad in my life. So in a triathlon, normally the transition is as rapid as possible. What you don't want to do is waste time in that transition, having worked so hard on the previous discipline and about to work hard on the next. You don't want to give away time. In this challenge, it was entirely different, because what we were looking at was safety. So we took the decision to lengthen that transition, to make sure that I was rewarmed, to make sure that I was absolutely dry. Because what you have to think is that as we move on to the bike, air temperature at that stage, it's still only 6 a.m. The light is only just coming up, it's still dark. Air temperature is below freezing. And then you're on a bike moving at 25 miles an hour with airflow coming across you, you cool very, very rapidly. And if you're starting from a pre-existing low level of heat, then you're going to cool to dangerous levels very, very rapidly. I mean, despite the freezing temperatures, actually, the one memory that I have is the beauty, the absolute beauty of the northwest of Scotland. I mean, just stunning scenery. Moving through the mountains, the white snow-covered mountains, and the wildlife. You know, almost it felt like around every corner there was a huge stag just watching me, wondering why I was out there on my own. Because it was on your own, it was isolation. You know, apart from me and the team, there was literally nobody. During the bike itself, next to this beautiful environment that I was cycling through, it was freezing cold. And obviously that's affecting the periphery, my hands, but particularly my feet. Underneath the wheels themselves on the road surface, it was glistening and there was a lot of ice in places. So making sure I kept concentrating to avoid the ice, which was particularly problematic actually downhill, where you're moving that little bit quicker, a bit more difficult to avoid as you're going at speed. As the cycle progressed, the weather got worse and worse, and in particular that wind and those side winds were starting to become a real problem. Where you're in the tree line, you're fairly protected. As soon as I came out of the tree line, there were these gusts of wind from the side, which were moving me about the road. And so all I'm thinking in the back of my mind, there is a big storm coming, is that we are isolated. We're in the middle of nowhere. The nearest hospital is hours away. And if something happens, which it can, we would be in real trouble.
How you doing, bud?
Good man, good.
Yeah, good.
It's cold, mate.
Cold.
Cold.
Right, the ice, there's loads of ice on the sides now. It's getting the temperature dropping. It's feeling it.
Almost to the minute that it was predicted Storm Bara would arrive, it arrived with a vengeance. And as much as the snow makes a difference, it's actually the wind on the bike that really does become dangerous. And so we tried to combat it by drafting by the side of the vehicle, by being behind the vehicle, but effectively nothing was working. The force of the wind was so high, it was picking me and the bike off the road and moving me across the road. And at this point, it started to become incredibly dangerous to be out there on the bike.
Greg, sorry mate, we're going to have to call it. We've got a severe weather warning here. We've gone up to amber level. You're going to have to turn around. I'm really sorry, buddy. Over.
So I've got an earpiece in, listening to the follow vehicle and effectively listening to Bally, who's in charge of my safety. And he called it. He said it was the end of the cycle at that point. And it was an interesting time, really, because for me, it was the balance between I wanted to go on, I felt great, the bike was going really well, but at the same time, it was becoming more and more dangerous just to be out there.
The decision to turn around was made just as we were pulling into the town of Gairloch, which was always our goal. I'd hoped to go beyond there and see some more of the spectacular countryside along the Keltman route, but I knew that I still had a very difficult journey ahead of me to get back to the second transition point, and beyond that, a half marathon run still to go as the full force of the storm began to rage around me.
I know you just...
That wind is just brutal. Yeah. I mean, I was flying, I felt
still did
great.
it. I mean, you still did lots, but we just couldn't go the whole way. Yeah.
But just every time you came into a clearing, the bike was like literally picking me across the road. As soon as I stop, all of a sudden it sort of comes into focus what had actually happened on the bike, that the pain started to rise, particularly in my hands and my feet. And it's actually what we call reperfusion. So what starts to happen is we start to get blood flow back into those limbs. Everybody knows this when they go out in the snow and make snowballs. Their hands feel fine until they come back into the warm house, and that's when the pain really starts. And so the pain in my hands and feet when I stopped and got into the warm band was absolutely excruciating. So we started the run, and it just felt like nature was saying to me, what are you doing? Why are you out here? And the ferocity started to grow. The winds really picked up, and then came the snow. And effectively we found ourselves in this incredibly remote, beautiful location in the Highlands of Scotland, in the middle of a blizzard, of a named storm. And certainly there's no doubt about it, it was right on the edge of what is possible. The one point on the run where it really changed was when we took a left off the main road and we started to climb into the mountains. And the further up we climbed, the heavier the snow got. And I think the interesting thing was that through the walkie-talkie, we could hear that there was significant concern from the rest of the team.
Well, I think the problem is that like Greg is, feeling ill.
Rough,
he's lost his voice. His throat is absolutely like red raw, and he's clearly in a state that bike ride absolutely destroyed him. He was already knackered from the cold in the water. Yeah. And just to be out in this, I genuinely, although like I know that he'll just keep going and want to keep going, but I am genuinely concerned for his well-being.
But we pushed on because we could see the summit to this particular hill. And so what we did is we went up and then started to descend. And that's when we then came back onto the main road and met up with the team, who I think they were more delighted to meet up with us than we were. You could see the relief on their faces that we were back on target. Ultra endurance exercise is always pushing you to the limit, and particularly because it's quite a personal thing. It is isolating, and so having the right mindset is absolutely crucial because you're having to deal with that. It's not something that you can necessarily share, and I think particularly during this challenge, we were pushing to the edge of the envelope. We were right on the edge of what would be deemed as safe. So now we're just over halfway through the run and the light is fading fast. It was the weirdest experience. We went from light to dark almost instantaneously. It was like somebody switching a light off. I've never experienced it before. And almost at the same time, what started to happen was that the snow turned to sleet. And with that sleet comes wet. You start to get wet. And before I knew it, I was absolutely drenched. The one thing that I remember distinctly is that my gloves filled up with water. And so inside the glove, I'm clenching my fist to avoid where the water is. Why does it make a difference? Well, the bottom line is with high winds and freezing temperatures, when you get wet, you lose heat much more rapidly. And it was the most extraordinary experience that I have ever had. And that was, I was actually running along and we're running at about a 1:45 half marathon pace. We're clipping along, we're moving at speed, generating lots of heat, and yet I am shivering while I'm running. I'm so cold. The fact that the core body temperature is low enough to drive this shivering thermogenesis response, this shivering response, tells you that there is a real battle going on inside and you are teetering on the edge of hypothermia. And the interesting thing now is the fight that's going on inside my brain is that the problem with the cold is it's insidious, it's omnipresent, it's always with you, can't get rid of it. And what you know is you're not going to warm up. And so the question is, can I cope with how cold I am? And the only way to maintain that temperature is to maintain the pace. As soon as you slow down, you lose more heat, you get colder and colder. So what I can't afford to do is slow down. So in my brain, there's this fight going on, which is saying, you're cold, stop. There's a car behind you, it's nice and warm, get in the car and warm up. And on the other side, it's saying, keep going, keep driving, keep the pace up, maintain that temperature, and you will get to the end. At this point, the happy bank becomes absolutely crucial because now what you are doing is you are basically drawing out from that happy bank continuum. There's nothing going into it. And so the amount of reserves that you've got in that happy bank are absolutely crucial. So that means the amount of training you've done, the amount of preparation and planning that you've got in there, which has filled up the happy bank, now becomes incredibly important. But of course, with the temperature as it was, with incredibly numb hands and face and ears and nose and core temperature dropping, the question that sits in your mind is, have I got enough in that happy bank? Are there enough reserves to get me to the finish? Because I am withdrawing at such a rate now that to cope with what's going on, you have to then be able to just look inside and decide whether what you have got available to you is enough to get you to the finish. We knew where the end point was because from the plan that we made, it was on the entry to Torridon. Literally, as we entered Torridon, that would be the end of the run. But of course, in the pitch black, we couldn't tell where that was. And the weather was just getting worse and worse. And we're being buffeted on the run by the wind. And the sleet was coming down, we were soaking wet. And we really couldn't see what the end point was. It was only the feedback that we were getting from our watches that were telling us how much further we had to go. And as we drew to the end, I just distinctly remember that we were literally on the edge. I was absolutely on the edge of my capacity, without any shadow of doubt. And we came round a slight bend, and as we came round the bend, the lights lit up the sign for Torridon, and we could see one of the vehicles with the camera team on, and it was just like, it was almost like a dream come true. It was one of those things that we'd waited all day long for. And I don't honestly think I've ever been so happy to see the camera team in my life as when they came into view. And at that point, it was that balance between a sense of achievement, having got through this brutal day, but also this overwhelming sense of relief that it was finally over. So at the finish, that hug with Baldy was just so sweet. I mean, just fantastic, you know. But it's a strange situation because psychologically, you've been focusing all day, I've been focusing on performance and staying alive. And all of a sudden that dissipated, it disappeared, it was gone. And so at this point, nothing mattered. I had finished.
If that is not extreme, I don't know what is.
And the weirdest thing is I stumbled into the road. And in fact, the only car for about a 500-mile radius came along the road at that point and almost hit me. And actually, if you're watching, I really apologise for that. Entirely my fault. But it's a strange thing when you effectively at that point, I'm not thinking about anything. I'm just being moved around. Somebody put a coat on me, moved me to the car, put me in the car. All of that without conscious thought, because effectively what I'd done is I'd let go. The day following the event, I remember reflecting on what we had achieved. And I think what was interesting was that there were so many occasions in the lead up to the challenge where we could have stopped. The global pandemic of COVID, the closure of swimming pools and leisure facilities and gyms, and then the cancellation of Patagon Man. We could have stopped at any stage, but we didn't. What we did is we planned and we replanned, and we set ourselves this challenge in the northwest of Scotland in winter, a period of time in a place where nobody does anything like this. So we were pushing the envelope and pushing our capabilities, not only me as the athlete, but also the camera crew working and operating in these really, really difficult environments. And yet we did that without any hesitation, without thinking that we were going to stop. And I think the one thing that I take from that is the fact that with the right planning, with the right team, with the right mindset, anything is possible, and we can all be unstoppable.
So, what's next for you then, Greg?
Man, you know what, it's too soon to say really. That said, I have had this crazy idea.